Welcome back to our ongoing mixing series where we'll be mixing a song all the way from the beginning to a finished mix. And this is part 1. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the DAW and talk about the first step of our mixing process. Hey yo, it's Alex from Metamind Music, and as always with this channel, it's my mission to help you, the artist, produce themselves by developing their mindset, expanding their creativity, and connecting to their music in a deeper way. And in this video, we're going to dive into the first step of our mixing process. So if you're stoked, I'm stoked. Let's get into it. All right, so let's get into step 1 of the mixing process, and let's go ahead and transition to the DAW. Yes, sir. All right. All right, so let's get started with step 1 of our mixing process, which is to organize our session. All right, so in this video, we're going to go over naming our tracks, organizing our tracks, color coding our tracks, and also bouncing anything down that we need to audio to save CPU space, as well as grouping any tracks together to reduce that track count to make our session a lot easier to navigate right off the bat. And a good way to think about this step is to really just set yourself up for success so that you can navigate your session easily, that you know where everything is, that you're familiar with it, and you're reducing the amount of tracks that you're working with to make the whole process a lot simpler. Another great way to think about this is that if you were to send your session to a mixing engineer for them to mix, you would have to do this step. You would have to organize your tracks, name them, bounce down all of your MIDI to audio, and make sure that everything is organized and well named to send to that mixing engineer. All right, so the great thing about this step is that it's not too difficult and it feels great to get a session organized. So before we actually dive into that, I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of what we're working with. This is a song of mine that I'm working on, and we're going to mix this bad boy all the way to the finish line. All right, so I'll give you a little bit of a taste of the song that we're working with, and I've already done some mixing here, but don't worry, we're going to go over everything that I have already done, as well as tweaking it and refining it as we go. So I'm going to play you a little bit of this track, and then we're going to jump into finalizing this first step. All right, so there's a little taste of what the song sounds like. It's kind of like EDM, psychedelic meets heavy rock guitars, just kind of a mishmash of styles. And of course, I've done some mixing as I went along, arranging this song and finalizing this song. But one thing to keep in mind, referring back to our last video, is that this song is already sounding quite good. Like all the sounds are working together. You can hear everything clearly. It sounds good and balanced. And that is a great way to start a mix, because what we're going to be doing is pushing it that last 15% to that finish line. All right, so with that said, we're going to go ahead and go through every track and name it, and then we're going to organize it per color and make sure we understand where everything is, as well as maybe adding in some markers just for clarity and ease of navigation. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with our bass at the top here. Okay, I'm using a plugin called Equator 2. That's why it's named that, but let's solo this track and listen to what it sounds like. All right, so that's a very heavy bass. So I'm going to rename this bass and then HVY for heavy, because I know what that means. So let's move on to, and I like to keep my basses red. So definitely using colors to identify what the instruments are in your session can be super valuable, because just at a glance, you know what every track is. So definitely come up with a color spectrum to attach to every instrument that makes sense to you, and keep it consistent because it will help you in the long run. So let's listen to the second bass track. So I've got this kind of side-chained bass vibe going on. So I'm going to just rename this bass just by itself. And we're going to close that. So now we have these two bass tracks that are red, 2 different ones. Let's move on to these drums and listen to this. So what I'm going to probably have to do with this is separate these drums into individual tracks for every element, right? Because right now we have one track with all of our drums, our kick, our snare, our hi-hat, our crash cymbals. But what I'm going to want is having different tracks for each of those elements. So we're going to do that a little bit later, but we're just going to move through the list and continue to organize. And I like to have my drum tracks orange. That's just what makes sense to me. So let's go ahead and do that, as well as the clips. So the clips inside here, I like them to kind of match. So there's our drums. So next we have this kind of Rhodes ambient dark sound. Sounds like this. Right, it's kind of haunting. So I'm going to just put keys for now. And if there's other keys, then I'll put another symbol in there to distinguish it from something else. And blue is fine for me for keys. Then we have our main guitar here. Right, so that's cool. It already has a good name. I'm just going to make these green as well. There we go. Guitar main. So now we have guitar left and right, and this is during the chorus. I'll solo these for you so you can hear what's going on. During the chorus, we have these heavy guitars that are just hitting these low notes, and there's a left and right. Pretty crazy sound. So guitar left is fine. Guitar right. Then we have guitar trip. I just like the word trippy because I put a lot of trippy stuff in my music in general. So this is like a super ambient, spaced out thing during the chorus. So I'll let you listen to that. Super long sustain with the EBow, which is really fun to use with your guitar. So guitar trip is fine with me. All right, so let's keep moving on. We have a guitar solo here. All right, so we named that guitar solo, and all our guitars are green. Then we have our synth main, which is the main motif of this song, actually. Let's solo this. So great, that's already named, and I like purples for my synths. Then we have another couple synths here that are left and right, so I'll play a part with these right over here. Playing some cool harmonies. So those are already named. Then we have the synth chord, which I'm actually going to recolor this another purple or pink or something. There we go. And this is during the solo. There's this like cool effect going on these chords, which are the same as the main motif. Cool. And then let's keep moving on. This is another drum track over here. So I'm actually going to color this orange, rename it drums to make all these orange. I'm going to move it beside our drum kit just to help us stay organized. I'm also going to move these keys over the guitars. Keep the rainbow going. And then we have these strings. Okay, so we have string parts that are happening in the verse as well as the outro of the chorus. Cool. So I'm just going to rename this to simplify it cello. And then rename this violin. Blues are fine. Then we have this kind of like digital arpeggio going on. This sounds pretty trippy in headphones. Pretty crazy, eh? So I'm going to keep this yellow is fine, and I'm just going to rename this ARP for arpeggio. Then we have whirly. This is like, I think a Rhodes melody. Whirly is fine with me. And this is kind of playing the role of a melodic instrument, so I'm going to actually move this towards the keys and the guitars, because it's kind of one of the main melodies of that part of the song. So let's keep going. Disaster chord. This thing, I think I was experimenting with this, but I don't think I ended up using any of it in the track. Disaster chord. This is just an instrument that I made, and I'm going to actually color this more of a purple because it's kind of like this super spacey pad, and I'm going to put it towards the pads. There we go. And apologies for any clips or pops that you hear. I'm kind of like pushing my computer to the max with this this mix and the recording software as well, so apologies. Simpler here. I don't think there's anything going on this track, so I'm safe to delete it. Loop, what is this? Drum loop. I don't think we ended up using this. No. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. Serenity, let's listen to what's going on here. I don't think we need to use this. We have that other one, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this. Then we have this Hong drum instrument, which sounds really cool, with a bunch of latency. But we're not actually using this in this song, so I'm actually going to go ahead and remove this just to clean up our session. And this other disaster chord has nothing going on, so let's delete it. So now we've reduced it to 19 tracks, which is totally workable, a lot more intuitive to be able to work with. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and add some more markers to just help clarify where the different sections of the song are. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a locator, and I call it intro. And I'm going to actually move it to when the song starts. So now if I hit this little playhead, it'll play the intro. Right? And let's rename this to verse 1. And this is, rename this one chorus 1. This is verse 2. And it goes into the solo. So I'm just going to click and drag this one. Boom. Rename this. Then this lands into second chorus, which is also the outro. Actually, it isn't the outro. My mistake. So let's rename this chorus 2. And then we have an alternate version of the chorus, which I wanted to fade out. Super happy sounding. Rename that outro. So now if we zoom out, we can see all the parts of our song, which is very handy. All right, so next what we're going to do is group any tracks together that it makes sense to group, just to simplify processing if we want to apply processing to a bunch of tracks or control the volume of a bunch of tracks at the same time. So typically what I'm going to do is I'm going to group all of my like instruments into groups. So let's go ahead and select these two bass tracks, and you can select group tracks here. And now I'm going to rename this bass. Okay, so now we have a group for our bass. Our drums, we can actually group these two drums, do the same thing. And we still have to expand some of this. So now we have a group for our drums, and we have to still expand those drums, which we'll get into later. So we can actually group all of these guitars. If you want to rename something, the shortcut is Command R, GTR. And then we can actually, whirly in the keys can be grouped, I think. Could probably throw the ARP over here as well. So I would group these three because they all kind of live in that mid-range frequency area. So I'm going to select them all. You can hit Command G to group as well. Command R to rename this. Melody. Rename that keys because they're all kind of key instruments. And then all of this could be synths. So let's group these. And then the cello and the violin. Again, group these. Rename it. Strings. All right, so just as easy as that. Now look at how simplified our session looks like, right? We have all of these groups and they're all color coded. We know where everything is. We can solo them very easily. We can add processing to groups very easily. We can navigate the session super easy. All of these things will save you time in the long run. All right, and I should mention, this is a very important step, is that before you do any major editing, such as bouncing MIDI to audio or even deleting tracks, I would probably do this before deleting anything, is to save this as a new project. So I'm going to go ahead and hit File, and I'm going to hit Save Live Set As. And I'm going to call this Love Sing Dance instead of Edit, Mix. And then we're going to go to where it's saved, Project Drive, in its own session here. Boom. All right, so now we've saved this as a new project, which is very important, so that if you accidentally delete something or change something that you can't revert, you have your old session with everything untouched, okay? That's extremely important. I have lost work by not doing this step, so definitely learn from my mistakes and just do this step, and you'll thank me later. All right, and real quick, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna listen back to this whole song and just give special attention for any edits, any final edits that have to be done. That's another thing I should mention, is that before you start mixing, okay, before you get into the weeds and actually try to finalize a mix with the song, you want to make sure that the arrangement is finalized, okay? Because another way to look at this is if you were to send your session to a mixing engineer for mixing, you would have to finalize your arrangement. You can't go in there and change the MIDI notes or like move a snare around or add a sample. That's it. It's finalized. And you don't necessarily have to hold yourself to that super religiously, but it can be very useful to help you actually move forward and finalize something so that you can actually finish it and move on to something else afterwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to listen to this and then I'm going to pay special attention for any final edits or anything that I feel is still off. But if not, then I'm going to go ahead and finalize everything, print it to audio, and then finalize this. All right. So I've gone ahead and started the process of bouncing down the tracks that were MIDI tracks to audio. And the reason why I am doing this is that if you have a software instrument, a virtual instrument being triggered by MIDI, first of all, it uses more CPU resources. And second of all, there can be misfires that happen between MIDI triggering a virtual instrument versus that if you print it to audio, then it's kind of committed to audio. It's a lot easier on your CPU, and there's no chance of errors happening with MIDI triggering that virtual instrument. And again, this is not necessary to bounce down all your tracks to audio if you're mixing your own music, if you want to make some tweaks to the MIDI in your performances as you're mixing. But I would suggest that if you can, it's a good move to commit to audio to save CPU and to commit your parts. Because once you print your parts to audio, you can't go in there and change them too much, okay? They're committed, and making that kind of commitment allows you to move forward without constantly going back and tweaking things and changing things, and allows you to actually move forward. So I've gone ahead and done this with our bass. So our bass is now audio. With our drums, I went to Superior Drummer and I made sure that each of these tracks are only playing back one part of the kit. So we have our kick, snare, hi-hat, crash, ride, tom 2. Our guitars were already all audio, so that was cool. I did it to our keys. And now I'm working on the synths. And there's a couple of ways you can go about bouncing something to audio. So for example, if we have this synth chord, let's listen to it real quick. Sounds like this. Turn off the metronome. All right, so the most obvious way is you could go ahead and insert an audio track. Okay, and then you could decide for the input of this track to be synth chord. Let's go find that. Synth chords, the first one here. So now the input of this track is the output of this track. And we're going to go ahead and make this monitor in and record arm. And then now, if you wanted to, you could go ahead here and hit record. And then all of the audio output of this track will be recorded to this track. And you can do this and it'll do it in real time. And then all of the effects that you have on your MIDI track will be printed down into audio. All right, so let me show you a second method to bounce down your MIDI tracks to audio. The first one was just recording the output of your track to an audio track. And what that will do is that whatever processing you have on that track will be printed to audio and it will be all baked into the sound. So it's a great way to save CPU if you want. But let's say you wanted to keep this processing, but not necessarily commit to all of it and be able to tweak the settings afterwards. So I'm going to show you how to do that as well. So first and foremost, you can go ahead and duplicate this track. So I've just duplicated this track. So these two are the same. And on the track that I'm going to bounce down to audio, I'm going to go ahead and select all of these plugins except for the instrument. So Scalar 2 is the instrument. And I'm going to delete them because we have them on the duplicate here. And now with this one, without any of the processing, I'm going to flatten this so we can bounce it down to audio. So you can right click in Ableton and hit freeze track. And what this will do is actually freeze all of the settings of all of your plugins so that you cannot change any of the settings. And this is a great move if you're running into CPU issues, if you're hitting the ceiling and like hearing clicks and pops. You can freeze tracks which are with a bunch of effects and plugins on them, and it will significantly reduce the CPU load of those effects. However, you can't change any of the settings. They're frozen into the settings that they're at. So that's what we're doing here. And I opt into this method, the freezing and flattening, because it is a little bit quicker than having to record the output of a whole track for the length of a whole track. You can just go ahead and freeze it and then flatten it, and it does the same thing. All right, so once your track is frozen, you'll notice that it turns blue. And when it's blue here, I can't actually go in and change any of the settings of my plugins or my effects because it's frozen, which again, it frees up CPU space. Good move to use if you want to do that. But for our purposes, what we're going to do next is right click once again on the same track that's frozen and hit flatten track. And what this will do is actually render it into audio instantly, which saves us some time. So now we have our synth chords here, audio. Very cool. However, we lost all of our effects and the automation that was on those effects. So here's where the duplicate comes in. We can just open up the duplicate and we can take all of the effects that we have. I'm just going to right click, cut those out, and I'm going to paste them onto our now audio track with our synth chords. And now let's listen to make sure that all of the effects work. Great, so that sounds great. And now we can go ahead and delete this duplicate. And that's the process I kind of took for every single track to get it to audio, is I just removed any processing, froze it, flattened it, and then took the processing that I took off and put it back on. So I still have control over those effects, but now it's audio and it's committed to audio. And hey, if you're just getting started with music production and feeling completely overwhelmed by the whole process, or if you've been at this for a while but you're having trouble finishing those projects, or if you just want to get a glimpse inside my personal workflow, I've created a super easy to follow 7-step framework that helps you go from your very first ideas all the way to a finished mix and master. And it's super handy to have around the studio as a printout. So if you're interested in that, you can grab it in the description box below. So I'm going to go ahead and finish doing this process with the rest of our tracks. I'm going to bounce them down to audio, and that wraps it up for step 1. So to quickly recap, what we did is we organized all of our tracks, we named them, we color coded them, we grouped them, we added markers to our session so that we know where the different parts of our songs are, and then we went ahead and bounced all of our MIDI to audio to go ahead and commit the performance to a final arrangement so that we're not constantly going back and tweaking things and changing things. No, we're committing, and now we're moving forward. And with a session like this, I could send this to a mixing engineer and they could do a mixing job. So that's kind of how you want to think about it. You want to prepare yourself to think like a mixing engineer. So that's the trick. You want to kind of think like a mixing engineer when approaching the mix phase of your own music. So with that said, that wraps up this first step of the mix phase, which is organizing your session and your tracks to get it ready for the mix down. And in the next video, we're going to jump into getting our balance with our levels. So if you're stoked for that, I'll see you in the next video.